Hey, everybody. Welcome to our little corner of Virtual WorldCon. I'm Larry Nemecek, Dr. Trek, and I'm going to be your host and moderator and also participant guest today on a great topic, not to beat a dead horse and not to use an ancient metaphor, but we're all concerned about fandom in general. Star Trek is no stranger to that. Is it really as divisive as it feels? Is that just a product of online, or is that a product of our times? So I've got some great voices with us today. We're going to tackle that question. The group in here, hey. So from everybody, we're all blessed to have our cute little WonderCon at home things, our little placards. Yay. So first up, we've got Ali Martinez. You may know her now as 25-year-old Trekkie. She's the host of Tal Talk Tuesday. She's a podcaster with Trek Geeks on the new, soon-to-be debuting show, Who is Trek? And she's a Star Trek cosplayer and a big voice on Twitter that you know as T Trekkie back there. I'm really thrilled to have Ryan Britt with us today. If you don't know his face, you have certainly been reading his words all over the place. There, he's official. He writes for Sci-Fi Wire, Inverse, Dinner Geek, and StarTrek.com. His first book was over in that universe where they war all the time. His first book was Luke Skywalker Can't Read, but he's working on a book for 2022, Phasers on Stun, which will be out next year. And my longtime friend, John Champion, he's the co-host and co-producer of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. That's Mission Log and Mission Log Live, both. He's a producer of The Trek Files and Sci-Fi 5, which is a new show. You should check it out. And we've got Kennedy Allen, who's a producer and host at Women at Warp. There you go. And yeah, all the way. Black Tribbles and Your Away Team. It's a good group. And I wanted a good group. Oh, and I'm Dr. Trek. You may know me from the Trek Files podcast, from Trekland Tuesdays Live, from Life Support Live on Saturdays with Dr. Ali. One of us is a real doctor. If you go way back in your fandom, you may have a copy of the Star Trek Next Generation Companion with the Star Trek Communicator with, oh, thank you, Ryan.
Where is it? I have one. I promise I do.
Dead Tree Media. There we go. But anyway, all things Trekland and Portal 47, by the way, your mini-con all year long. But look, this is a topic that we're all punditry here. We talk about this, and I think all fandoms are aware of it. Sometimes we get caught up in our passion. We just want to like the thing we like. And in Star Trek, there's a lot to like. But as we've come to lean on social media, and especially in the pandemic, as we're all leaning on virtual outlets and talking to people without being live, this notion of what's happening, it's maybe a trend that started with Gamergate, and it's exploded here in the last few years with the bigger franchises, and now Star Trek is on the radar screens. It's on long range scans to short range scans, and it's crossing that median of this divisiveness. And I keep thinking, is this really about Star Trek, or is it really some underlying cultural things? And is some of it just innocence? It seems like we're more and more suffering fissures along maybe, and I don't mean to put things in the neat little boxes here, generational lines. But is it the Star Trek that divides, or is it some underlying culture? Everything from how tech savvy are individual people, what kind of media access do people have, what's our comfort zone with social channels? Is it just a thing of every generation, the older and younger and middles have different tastes because of the way the world was when they grew up? And is it the fact that things are shifting faster and faster? Instead of a 30-year generation, it feels like the generations are 5 to 10 years now. So we're going to talk about that. And I just want to go down the panel. We've kind of done an introduction of everybody, but when someone says to you, gosh, fandom is so divided, and with an eye on Star Trek fandom, what's your first take? What's your take on that? Let's just go down the line. Ali, what's your, we've got different perspectives here, hopefully. So we'll have this from, and I guess this is bubbling up that I'm the youngest of the baby boomers. So that's what my niche is, but I'll try to be open-minded. No. Ali, when I first bring this topic up, what comes to mind? And then let's go down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I'm 25, so I obviously come from a younger generation perspective on this. I'm right at the edge of being a millennial. I'm like the last millennial year that we get. But in regards to fandom, it's something that I've mostly experienced online. I've been to conventions and I've gone to Star Trek Las Vegas and WonderCon before. I've been there in person when it was in person, but I mostly experience it through social media means, by Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And so that's where I'm getting the majority of my information and interaction with other Star Trek fans or fandom fans in general. So I think that the divide has always been about difference in opinion, but like you said, it has definitely escalated, especially over the last year, where most of us have been, confined to quarantine and not able to go out and do conventions in person or interact with others. But honestly, I think that just that original difference in opinion has just crumbled into, I'm going to attack people that don't think the way that I think, rather than valuing different viewpoints and different ideas on different shows. But I think it also has to do with ownership, like you said, over a show or a property itself, in which we are so passionate about it that we say, oh, this is mine and it has to be the way I want it. And if it's not the way I want it, it's not okay. It's not my Star Trek, or it's not my Babylon 5. I mean, that's an older option, yeah. But especially for newer fans that are getting into older franchises, which I'll bring a little bit up later about, like you said, the nature of television, how that's evolved over time. But there's a lot of factors, and sometimes it's overwhelming to interact with people that are so divisive, rather than accepting. Hate speech aside, that's a big obvious, there's a big difference between different opinions and trying to legitimately harass someone.
Right. And I want to make a initial round here, but I do want to say here for the record, we've got racists and misogynists and just hardcore cranks that are out there. And whether it's live or they're finding a way online, they're going to be there, and that's bad. And we should we should deal with that and whatever. But I'm talking about people who don't have an obvious agenda. And I'm not talking about paid bots and trolls and that whole growth industry that's, finding root. I'm talking about like actual real people here. Those are all issues, and we know they're there, and we're getting, and we can talk about that too. I don't mean to exclude that, but I'm trying to get back to actual, genuine, sincere, real people. And is that universe in our modern case, and leaning so much on social and virtual, is that changing? So I don't know. So Ryan, what say you?
Well, I think
your
two things.
Take on all this.
My initial take on it is that I'm not sure, except for the amplification of it on social media, I'm not sure that it's particularly new. Something that I think about a lot when I think about Star Trek fans fighting is I think about how my father was just so against the next generation. Just so against the next generation in 1987 when I was 6 years old. Like, I remember, I'm on the other end, Allie, of being on the edge of being a millennial because I'm 39, so I'm on the other edge of that. And so I remember that, and I remember him being against Deep Space Nine. I remember him being against every single one. And I remember I was a kid, and so I was influenced by my father, but I also wanted to like and enjoy Star Trek. And so, if you take that and you times that by, several million, and you give a lot of those people Twitter accounts, and you add some decades in there, and they're fighting about Discovery. It might be a little bit reductive, but then I think about something that Michael Chabon said to me when I was interviewing him about short treks before Picard even came out, when he wrote Calypso for short treks. And I remember talking to him about how he got involved, and him saying, well, my first reaction to Discovery, I'm ashamed to say, was uh-oh. And he said, and I'll never forget this, that there is a conservative, not uppercase conservative, but lowercase c, impulse in a lot of fans when something new happens, and that their first reaction often is one of negativity. I think that by and large, if you walk next door to my neighbor's house, who had no idea up until a year ago that I wrote about Star Trek professionally, they would have no idea that the fandom wars online exist. They're just watching Discovery and they love it. And they're like, oh, you like Star Trek? And I was like, yeah, so I think that the perspective is like this. I think that my initial take is that this does happen a lot, and it has happened, and that progressivism always wins. And someone who's like, I hate Discovery because it's different, or I hate Discovery because I don't think it follows Roddenberry's vision, whatever they believe that means. I think that person ends up being potentially on the wrong side of history, 9 times out of 10. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't think that, I think that the art always outlasts the fandom argument. You know, and Deep Space Nine, like, look at the Voyager doc is proof of that. Like, everybody's celebrating, like, Voyager was never anyone's favorite show in common fandom circles in 1996. Mm-hmm. Kennedy, I'm done talking.
No, I was saying I liked Voyager.
Okay,
but no, but right, no, but I think that, like, right, I of course I loved Voyager, but I think that my point being is that I think that the conventional wisdom is always like, these shows will always find love, and I think that we have 55 years of data here, you know, and I think that it's not like a Doctor Who spinoff like the Sarah Jane Adventures where you're like, you know, you know what I mean? It's not quite the same. The Star Trek spinoffs like have this, they're an art form into themselves, and they have life beyond whatever the controversies are that are surrounding them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is bringing up two or three things too, but I want to get on down the line too. Well, he threw the kid. John, I'm going to save you for last. You talk every week.
Sure. Yeah, enough of me.
He tossed it to Kennedy, so I'll let you take that and run with it. Your initial take on this, because we can peel back some layers here for everybody a little later.
Yeah, this is a whole onion here. Well, I will say shout out to elder millennials. Like Ryan, I was born before Next Generation, but still in the 80s. I'm not going to give my exact year because time is a construct. And it's man-made anyhow, so who really needs to know this?
Go Prophets. Okay.
My exposure to Trek, I was a cradle Trekker in that my mom grew up on it, so she raised me on it and loved everything about Trek. So all the seasons, all the series that came afterwards were just part of, you know, the lexicon in the house. So in terms of a fandom experience generationally, I had very limited access outside of the home, right? I got roasted in school. Like, that was the source of my bullying growing up, was liking Star Trek. But my mom would go to conventions, and all her friends would go in uniform. They didn't call it cosplaying back then. They went in uniform.
You went in costume or went in uniform. Right?
We went in uniform. They were polishing boots and stuff. It was wild. And I would go and see other Trekkers then as a kid, but there wasn't any, you know, regular interaction like there is now with social media. Cut to, you know, recent Trek, I like to say, instead of new Trek, because it has a connotation now. Mm-hmm. Cut to recent Trek in 2017 when Disco came out. At first, I'll be honest, I'll admit it, I was like, what the hell is this? You know, I was so upset. I was like, why are we going back? We have the entire future to explore. I'm done. I just, And then I discovered Shazad Latif was in it, and I got over myself and fell in love instantly. Who knew? And saw Disco for what it was. And you're right, Ryan, in that it can be a little reductive, but Trek has always at its core been very heavy-handed with its message. Regardless what series you fell in love with, what series you grew up with, what series you hated, there was always a nail on the head. This is what needs to change for us to get here, you know, whether it was from, you know, having one side of your face black to the other side white, beefing with people with reverse, whether it was dealing with folks in gender expression issues. Like, it was always like, hey, this is a thing, we can fix it. In fact, Discovery is so heavily, I think, disdained because it's like, hey, change is hard. We know this. Let us help you through it. Here is everybody else that exists on this planet. Like, literally everybody else at every single intersection in between. Whatever you want, you got it here. You might have to look for the cis white men, but, you know, there's everything else. So they're in the back. They're here because we're not exclusionary, but they're in the back. But you're here, you know? And people who are accustomed to seeing themselves represented all the time in everything have a hard time accepting the fact that they're not alone. Whether that's a generational thing, whether that's, you know, any other group of communities that you want to consider in this. Yeah. I think the hardest part is that with Disco in particular is that because it's so heavily LGBTQIA and because the boomers that are upset about things changing, there's such a large chunk of the boomer community that was LGBTQIA that didn't make it. You know, I hate to get morbid, but they didn't survive for whatever reason, whether it was bigotry, hate crimes, AIDS crisis. Like, a lot of those folks aren't here to weigh in on this, to help develop it in a way that could maybe bridge that gap between folks who are a little more conservative with a big C, than folks who are just like, give me all the intersections, give me all the things. What? There's a non-binary, non-trill? Yes, yes, yes. Well,
Have we talked about the left-handed ones of them yet? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Like, it's okay. The other great thing about it is that there's something for everybody. You don't have to watch it if you don't like it. There's so much content out there that people
that's like the coming of the buffet effect of Trek. Like, be careful what you wish for back in the 90s. You're finally getting it, and some people are still freaking out about it.
Right.
What about you, John?
Gen X here.
No thought into this at all.
Yeah, no, not at all. Yeah, no, I find myself definitely having parallel opinions to everybody else here. And, you know, I grew up with Star Trek. Just my earliest memories are of Mego action figures and Star Trek color forms and Star Trek the animated series and TOS videotapes back when VHS was a thing. And the people who couldn't accept that, couldn't sort of find common ground with me, those were the bullies in school. But then when I started going to conventions when I was in my teen years, you know, that was where I found my tribe. And that's where I did find a level of acceptance and some education. You know, I found that what was exciting to me was meeting other fans who we already had some level of bonding because we enjoyed a similar thing, if not exactly the same thing. And then I also got to learn about other shows and other science fiction and other takes in this world that I didn't yet know about. So I found that to be great. And at a convention, at any convention, generically speaking, I would find that the people who were the most abrasive, the most negative, not the most embracing of other opinions, that was the vast minority. Those were the people who were quite a bit easier to ignore and not then ruin my experience. I think what you're getting at, and you know, I think what you're getting at here, Larry, and what's important about this conversation is that the internet has changed that in a really profound way. Now, for better or for worse, and very often for worse, every voice is equal. Every voice has equal prominence. So it's a lot easier to allow the really abrasive, really negative comments to sort of overtake what should be a positive and embracing conversation. I never want that to go the direction of erasing dissent and erasing criticism. I hope that what we do on Mission Log and on Mission Log Live and any place that there is conversation about Star Trek, particularly in the podcast world, is that we are being critical and thoughtful and holding what we look at to a high standard. But at the same time, you know, there has been this industry created around negativity and around, you know, the gatekeeping and a holier than thou fandom, which is really, quite honestly, put a negative experience on it for everybody.
Yeah, I'll just a shock jock type situation.
Yeah, truly, you know, and I'll just share, you know, one kind of really capsule version of this is that back in 2006 when I was going, I had been away from conventions for a while and then went to the Vegas convention for their big 40th anniversary celebration. And I had been watching Enterprise for the previous couple of years and it got canceled in 2005. And I really liked that show. I really liked the last couple of seasons of it, what I got out of it. But I was also reading commentary and criticism online, and I thought, wow, people hate this show and they just absolutely are trashing it. And I thought, now I'm going to Vegas and there's a lot of people from Enterprise who will be guests this year at this big 2006 convention. Do they realize that they are in for it, that people are just going to trash them because they hate Enterprise? And sure enough, I got there, and Scott Bakula has a bigger crowd than anybody else. That cast is having a better time than anybody else. And it just showed that, you know, the perception online was very different from the real world, or at least that self-selecting group who were going to a convention, because they were in it for the fun. They were in it to actually embrace the thing that they enjoyed, not to pick a fight.
That's what the thing it comes back to me is, and by the way, that whole new Trek term, I remember when the derisioners of Next Generation, and I would say, Ryan, that your dad and all of those people, I was a kid then, and I remember reading about them, screaming about these usurpers and how dare they. Of course, it was a binary thing. We had Star Trek and nothing else. There was no bloody A, B, C, or D. And so anything, the first usurpers, it's hard to think of the Next Gen cast as these wannabes, right?
Yeah, I mean,
but I think that was the way it came across, but it was like all that, and it's the same way with everything new now. It's really, it's not so much people are, to me, it feels like, they're not so much negative Nellies, but they love the thing they love so much. It's their passion run amok that turns into fear and anger that it's going away, and that it's going to change. But the term that the NU Trek, if you go back and look at the Interstat letters back then, the letter of comment zine that was like the highest level of fandom discussion that there was pre-internet. And New Trek wasn't so much derisive. They were just trying to find a way to talk about TNG and the original series, because people had talked about the original series, because that was all it's like when the first time I heard somebody say a corded phone, I'm like, oh, okay. I guess we need the word corded phone, because now phones have no cords. And so that's a throwback. You know, it's that kind of thing. So we suddenly needed words for things we didn't have. And New Trek, the whole thing they were talking about, New Trek went away because New Coke had just been a thing. And that was a disaster. So they didn't want to even call TNG.
Allie, you missed that.
That was all the context. But New Trek bubbled up as just a sincere way of trying to talk about TNG with that, but before people we'll just call it TNG. But that was back when it was like a black on one side, white on the other. It was like a binary choice. And then the minute DS9 came into the picture, it was like, oh. And then you had New Trek and the original series, you know, fading away as old, tired 60s, until suddenly it was retro cool again, you know, when everything went into malaise. But I part of this is the one thing I wanted to throw on top of this thing about going to cons is the last year or two, especially when we could do this. And of course, someday I hear these rumors we'll get to do this again. But when we're at live events, I specifically at DST in Europe and the Las Vegas, like walk around. And the last live Vegas, there was an effort by some of the really toxic tubers to raise money and go and just tell the world I don't know what they were going to do. It almost smacks of like January 6th. Like, we're going to go storm the gates and take things over. Oh, you are? Really? Okay, whatever. They were there with a little cluster of 2 or 3 people around them at a table. 95% of the world had no clue who they were. But more importantly, everybody you would see, people will still talk, like we said, legitimate criticism. Oh, I love Voyager. I like DS9 a lot more than I did 20, whatever. But this absolutely toxic layer, it doesn't exist. Who do you ever meet live now? Like, it's like in the old days, it was like a curmudgeon. It was like the prickly person, but you know that they had that reputation, so you knew.
And they always smelled. They smelled like Funyuns and hatred.
But who do you ever
let's say it? They always smelled
online. Who do you see that way live when you have a live?
Well, I think that the one thing I do encounter live, and I think that this is a theory I want to throw at the group and see what you all think. First of all, that Bakula story is amazing. I love that story, and I think that there is a data-driven version of that, in that I have been writing professionally about science fiction on the internet since 2010. So I can always weigh the number of page views that an article has against the number of negative comments, right? And when Disco started in 2017, it was a runaway hit for traffic at Inverse, where I was the editor. And I was, talking to Rainn Wilson, and I was talking to, the showrunners, Aaron Harberts at that time. The traffic was amazing. And so any negativity that I was seeing on Twitter was like totally disproportionate with the amount of people wanting to read articles. And I wasn't like writing articles about my opinions. It was just like, what did this mean in episode 5 relative to canon? Like, it was deep dive stuff that people were interested in. So I think that the data is always there for the invisible sort of majority, even if we can't go to a convention. These people are reading articles. They're interested. They want to know about what's what's happening with these shows. They want to read the interviews. They want to read the fan theories. They love it. But here's a theory I have in terms of people that you encounter in real life, because that's the question. And I have encountered this a few times. And this is what people say, is they say that they don't like to have to pay for it. Now, this is my, and I think this is the most, and this is my hope. This is the most hypocritical thing in the world, but I think it's a larger, and because I work in media and I'm a media journalist, I think about this. I think it is a larger problem. There is a platform bias that exists in all forms of the media. If Star Trek Discovery had been on Netflix, my theory is that 50% of this toxic fandom stuff wouldn't have existed, because it starts with the I'm not paying for it. But these people will willingly play for The Mandalorian and will willingly pay for all these other things. So the idea that there's like a brand X, notion with CBS All Access or Paramount Plus is this weird, like, consumerist capitalist thinking that somehow the $6.99 isn't worth it to watch Star Trek. And I find that to be something, because I had a guy at a shared office space right before the pandemic who was like, watched the first episode of Picard and like wasn't going to watch anymore. And I was like, I'd seen the first 3 and I was like, well, I kind of actually understand that, because I actually think that it doesn't really get going until like the 3rd episode. And I actually think that Picard would have been benefited by being released all at once. And I really like Picard, but he was like, I'm not going to pay for my subscription to keep watching because I wasn't. And I'm like, really? But you pay for all these other subscriptions. So, but I think that is a pervasive viewpoint, and it is reinforced by various journalists that certain streamers are better than others. And I think that has contributed in kind of like shadowy way to the disco haters, for lack of a better word.
Well, this
and
is my, okay.
And that's I don't know what you guys think about that. Maybe what you all think about that. Maybe I'm off there. I don't know.
No, I
throwing
think
one thing in the mix. That's my whole point about how much of this is Trek and how much of this is generations based on people, that by God, I'm not paying for my Star Trek. God meant for Star Trek to be free, but how much of that is really about people dealing with the tech, the pivot here toward, free to cable, now cable into streaming channels, and having to, some of it is just tech averse. I remember a panel where we never got to this, people taking Discovery apart on the merits because we had to wade through 30, 40 minutes of people not even being angry, but there was just befuddlement about how streaming worked. Like,
but all these people pay for Disney Plus. All these people play for Netflix.
Yeah.
But that's what I mean about just how much of this is just going on in culture and it's reflecting here. But go ahead, Ken.
I think we're hitting a number of points that are going on simultaneously, right? First and foremost, the exchange of information is going to be altering for folks who aren't accustomed to being able to communicate people this rapidly, right? You would think the Trek fans would be like on it because we've been watching a society develop this way, but who knows?
It's the reputation, but it doesn't always. Yeah.
But I also think what we are describing and what a lot of us are feeling without recognizing is what I like to call reboot fatigue, in that so many properties are being rebooted, so many things are being rehashed and remade and recut, and there's very little original, like OG original content coming out nowadays. That there's nothing to diversify one's palette with. So people are apprehensive about looking at anything. I don't want to say apprehensive. People are going to have a point of reference for anything that's being rebooted because they've fallen in love with it for whatever reason or hated it for whatever reason. As far as all of the vitriol that Discovery is catching, I think you were hitting the point there, Ryan, to a degree, in terms of had Disco been on Netflix, people would have not had an issue with it, or people just not wanting to pay for subscription service, because that was definitely me. My thing was I didn't want to pay for one show, you know what I mean, regardless of anything. I wasn't watching anything on CBS, but then Picard came out. And I feel like a lot of people in my experience were like, oh, well, if it's 2 shows, I'll pay for it. And have proceeded to take deuces all over Disco. And it all stems from a place of, And I'm going to take it there. They weren't willing to pay for a subscription service that had a black female lead, but they'll pay for a subscription service that has a familiar face who happens to be a white man. You know what I mean? Who can deny Patrick Stewart because he's amazing? But at the same time, like, you had an opportunity to get in on Jump Street, and I'm including myself in this. This is not a holier than thou critique. This is, me as well. I had the opportunity to hop on this from Jump Street and develop a love for this organically like everybody else, but I chose not to for a multitude of reasons. And I think when people have similar experiences and then realize that whatever it was that they're accustomed to when they look to get from this fandom has now shifted and progressed, whether they're ready for it or not, they're upset about it. And you will always, always, always get more negative reviews about something than you will positive reviews, because people leave notes when they're pissed. They very rarely leave notes when they're excited. Now, I feel like it's kind of a blend right now because of the internet, but if Disco was a Yelp review, like, I'm pretty sure all of those comments would have you thinking it's a terrible show, when in reality it reflects the fact that Star Trek is a self-editing document, just as our society is a self-editing document. Like, we're constantly in revision if we're expecting to progress at all. And I learned this from Star Trek, by the fucking way, you know what I mean? Pardon my French. That obviously the people who are creating this show are also going to be a representation of that illusion, or evolution rather. So the art's going to change too. And it's like, it's hard. Change is difficult. Like, breaking conditioning is always going to be rough, period.
As one of the oldest classic characters, I believe, once said, change is the essential nature of the universe.
Right. People swing from Spock's nipples. They swing from his green nipples, but they won't practice what he preaches. And I don't understand what the problem is.
Allie, I want to know if all this sounds like so much mumbo jumbo about change and changing and hanging on and having to pivot your tech affinity and all of that.
No, actually, I really resonate with something Kennedy just said, in that the fact that Star Trek is constantly evolving, not just obviously in the fact that technology is different now than it was in the 60s, and we have the ability to do some incredible, like VFX, prosthetics, but the fact that the show itself evolves and is a reflection of the time itself that it's set in. But there are people that don't understand that evolution can happen. They say, if this isn't TOS, this isn't Star Trek, back to the whole Rod or Gene's vision, all that stuff. But I don't know that I would want to watch TOS for, I like the change. I like the difference. I want a different story. And that there was some resistance, obviously, from myself with certain series. I grew up with Star Trek. I'm also, my parents are hardcore Trekkies, maybe not as much as me, but I would, walk out in the living room in the middle of the night, and my dad would be falling asleep watching a rerun of TNG at 3 a.m.
Okay, but when you said Star Trek, you meant TNG, right?
Well, actually, my first Star Trek I remember was Enterprise, like really remember, because that was what was running when I was about 5 or 6 years old.
It's been a long road.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, you're like Noah Aberbat's Katz, the Mary Wiseman's husband who played Rin on Discovery. His Star Trek was Enterprise, and that's what I interviewed him earlier this year, and he was like, I was like, that's because he's 10 years younger than me,
which blows people's minds, and that's there was a time.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Allie.
The 90s, whatever,
no,
and it was like, who cares about this old dusty stuff from the 70s and 80s or even the 60s? I'm a rerun baby, I should say. Thank you, Mrs. Pollard in 9th grade, my science teacher, who sent me home to watch Star Trek. She couldn't believe I hadn't. So I was an after-school rerun baby. I did not see the 60s, but I remember thinking in '87, shut up. What are you people griping about? You worked for 20 years. I worked for 10 years to get Star Trek back on small screen TV. Why are you complaining? This is what you wanted. That was amazing. But anyway, I lost my chain of thought.
But Larry,
I started to jump in.
No, that's okay. It's just the interesting thing really is I've presented Star Trek to some of my friends who are not inclined. Like they didn't grow up watching Star Trek. They knew nothing about the property. Other than the fact that I was obsessed with it.
Were they otherwise geeks, or were they totally geek averse?
No, just like not really sci-fi fans, not
Okay.
really fans
Not-
of like any huge major,
Not
you know,
Harry
stuff
Potter,
you'd go to
not
cons
Wars,
to
not- okay.
celebrate. And
What?
I'll
Get rid
show
of them.
them.
You don't need that kind of negativity in your life.
I'm trying to convert them.
Okay, all right,
but-
that works.
They're just
But
vacuum
I
vessels.
show
They're not
them.
negative.
I've had them over to watch Star Trek because I'm like, hey, can you come over and just watch an episode of Discovery? Like I usually start them there, which is another whole conversation entirely of like where to start, especially for new people entering the franchise. But the thing about that is that they don't have that background of all those other shows, and that's where those opinions are coming from. Of like, oh, okay, I have all this other stuff to compare it to, but they're just coming in fresh, and so they obviously have a different outlook on it, but they don't go into like, oh, well, Spock can't look like that, because they don't know that. Right. Or they go, oh, that ship isn't exactly right. That refit doesn't look exactly the way I want it to, because they don't have that background. But
and
just
to me,
that
precious.
I know.
Yeah.
And I'm spewing out all this stuff, and they're looking at me like glazed over eyes, like have no idea what's going on.
I want to say something about starting someone with Discovery is that recently both my literary agent and my editor at Penguin both are like kind of they're not the most Trek educated, which is very interesting, because then it makes me work like really hard with my writing. You know what I mean? Because they're like, and so my agent was like, where should I start? And I said Discovery, because I was like, it's actually going to be the easiest for him to just start with Discovery. It's a new show. It has new production values. It's written like other shows in that it has a season-long arc. And the acting is really good. Like the acting is really good. There's famous people in it. Shahzad is also amazing. Have you ever talked to him, Kennedy, in person?
If I ever had the chance, that would be Kennedy Alan Latif. Okay,
he's wonderful. He's the best. Anyway, I think that I just wanted to say I actually really like. And my wife was always kind of like on the fence with Star Trek. She like saw Star Trek Beyond with me in the theater and stuff, but she was kind of like, yeah, it's fine. But then when I started writing about Discovery and it came out, she was hooked. And every season she's liked more and more. Mm-hmm. And now that we have book, my wife's just like, it's her favorite show ever. Well, right. But like my point is that I think that it's an amazing series for someone to start with, because it actually gives you everything you need to know.
Interesting. I don't know if I would have started somebody.
Let me throw this out too. And this is something that I came across a couple of years ago, and I really got into it on Trekland Tuesdays Live. I'm waiting for this whole, again, not just Trek, but reflecting the culture, and the culture I compare this a lot to the culture at large dealing with the coming of the atom bomb. And if you've ever seen the documentary, The Atomic Cafe, I've mentioned this once or twice on some of my shows, but there's a whole arc I saw a documentary that changed my life called The Atomic Cafe in grad school, like it was the early 80s. And I didn't know at the time, it's like the making of Star Trek book. I didn't realize at the time this was like so groundbreaking. Just like I didn't realize the old original making of Star Trek book was the first time anybody explained making any TV to a lay audience. It was revolutionary besides just being about Star Trek. But that snarky documentary, we're going to let all the words and visuals, tell the story, not some heavy-handed voiceover announcer leading you through this. But the story was the on the surface story is the atom bomb and us, from the leading up to it as a weapon. Oh yay, we won the war quickly, to it's cool, and atomic power meant hot. All the pop culture songs and movies and references to what it meant, and it was something modern and cool and snazzy and jazzy, and here's Miss Atomic 1946, all the way through oh wait a minute, this is spooky. Oh, now the Russians have the bomb. Ooh. And then duck and cover and the civil defense drills, and then into the no nukes and all the dystopia then by the 70s, and then, the day after in the 80s, and just that long road of something that was such a shock to the culture, how the ripple effect came over. And I think that's where we are with social media. And we started off with, Twitter and MySpace and Facebook. Bands had Facebook pages and MySpace pages. And then Twitter, and now Facebook, I can keep up with my grandma and my class reunion. And then the last 2 or 3, 4 years, we've had we've seen the dark side of all of this and what can happen. And even you watch some of the documentaries, the people who developed all these the Facebook aspects it's like the guys working on the atomic bomb. They're all like Oppenheimers. I had no idea this was going to turn dark and would be used for bad purposes. And now it's just a matter of, we've just got to educate ourselves to be aware of that's what's happened, much less what to do about it. And I just want to throw that out. What can we do about, we talk about not all fandom is online. Okay, fine. But that's a heavy influencer. That's the tip of the spear. It's great to get out and talk to people live and realize that doesn't exist.
Not all fandom is on social media.
Right.
I think is what that was the point I was trying to make.
Still swayed by what, because that's especially in pandemic. So what is this, just a matter of, it's going to be a curve of educating everybody, not just in Star Trek, but in politics, in culture, up and down the line.
I think with Star Trek and with geek discourse in general, I because I write and been writing professionally about science fiction for 10 years on the internet, and I've watched the ways in which, you get all your traffic from Facebook, you get all your traffic from Twitter, you get all your, actually you never get your traffic from Twitter, you get all your traffic from Instagram, you get all your traffic from Apple News, is I've seen all the traffic referrers come and go. And the publications have more or less stayed or changed, right? And actually, if you look at the Rotten Tomatoes for Discovery Season 3, it was its highest ever. So that's coming from critics and pundits online writing about it. So I think there's a big difference between what is happening.
Better each year, but yes.
Yeah, right. Michelle Paradise is amazing, right? Like, she's an amazing showrunner. And there was a real vision with Season 3, and you could really see it. But I think that my point is that, like, I think this is just from my professional standpoint, is I think there's a big difference between saying everyone hates Discovery, if you're talking about Twitter, and then looking at the actual critical eye of it and then seeing what influence that has on the larger culture. So, like, that's my thing, is like, I can talk to different journalists and critics that I know, and I'll get different opinions, but they're nowhere close to the shock jock things you're talking about, Larry, of people on social media creating a lot of vitriol. So I think that, like, there is a,
well, that to me is just an industry that's come along with the coming of social media.
I guess I mean that someone is more likely to read an article on Apple News written by, or listen to a podcast that was recommended to them on their phone from somebody smart, like the people that are here. And I think that those smart podcasts that all of you do come to people through different ways. I know that they're often recommended to me in different ways that aren't just Twitter. So I don't know. I don't know if I think that social media has as much of an influence over Star Trek fandom, because I just don't see it in the numbers. In the readership that I see of articles I write, I just don't see it.
Well, a lot of people have gotten
the referrals
depressed,
coming from Twitter.
I think a lot of old-time fans have gotten depressed because they're on social and they see that. And part of what I'm trying to say, well, here, let me throw this out too, and please, everybody jump in. But 2 or 3 years ago, I started to say this. A guy, this is not Star Trek, Star Wars, but it's the first time, and maybe it's the first time it penetrated to popular media, but an academic, a grad student, did a survey of the whole Last Jedi Rian Johnson hate campaign on Twitter, which I wasn't part of. It wasn't my world, but I got it. But his methodology was to this massive wall of Twitter hate about it. What he did was he broke it down and put some parameters on it, sat down, looked at a certain time frame from the time of the announcement to a certain time after it was released. And apparently there's all kinds of hate on all kinds of levels at Rian Johnson, director, but he basically got his arms around some measurables. And that's what this is. We have this feeling, this emotion, and like, let's measure some data, and kind of what you were talking about, Ryan, looking on the business end of it, but he's looking organically. Let's not look at numbers of tweets. Let's look at the accounts. Let's look at the accounts and see if we can find people who are multiples. And actually, yes, look and see if some of these are actual bots or trolls or actual organic real people, and get some arms around it. And what he found out was the wall of negativity in this one case with that time frame, only written to Rian Johnson by people, and then going through and looking at the accounts, combining accounts from the same person. But then rather than measuring the numbers of tweets, just looking at the account holders, getting it down to the account, not the number of tweets. And when you did that, he got down to, I used to talk about the negative 10% in Star Trek in letter days, and you'd see the letters pop up in Interstat or Starlog or whatever. And I'd say, well, and I didn't think about them as being negative. I just talked about them being the loud 10%. And they were there, but if you were in that arena, you'd see them. And he's talking about, he's seeing basically in this case study, 10% of that honest, organic, negative critique, negative, and then another 5% of everything basically being obviously paid trolls, and another one being obviously actually automatic bots. So you've
Well,
got still, it's not overwhelming the conversation. They're tiny slivers, but look what those two slivers did. They basically doubled the old negativity. And for people that just see negativity and not, slicing and dicing it down, it basically looked like everything had doubled. It's still a
right.
minority. That's still 20% out of, it's still 80% the normal world just discussing and loving, or loving, critiquing lovingly. But that's one time when somebody actually, sat down, put this under a microscope and got it. And that's just one case study. And that kind of suspect it, but it's that feeling. Those are accounts. That's not the numbers. But if those few accounts are just spewing, and if the bots are spewing it, we're feeling overwhelmed, and that's sad. But to me, that's part of the education curve. Is I keep preaching at people, if you start feeling yourself sliding into an argument with someone online, go check them out. And again, that's not being live, because we all grew up with live fandom where you had your 5 or 6 buddies and you knew the one guy was kind of the wacky guy, but we all loved him because he was kind of the grinchy guy, but you at least knew he was a real person.
Sure,
So
but I think, to your point, the bots are something that we can't hold accountable.
Right.
Right.
Right. But we can educate the world about them.
What we're all going to experience really quickly, if we haven't experienced it already, is that we're all going to need to re-socialize, right? A lot of us have been deprived of socialization. Human beings are social creatures. We need to be able to commune both verbally and collectively with each other in order for us to do well as a species. And a lot of
getting out of the bunker.
Right. Just being able to interact with somebody in a way that forces you to recognize that this is a human being in front of you that has feelings and hopes and fears and traumas and all that other stuff, that you can't just talk without being mindful of what a person has experienced. Again, something you'd think that Trek fans would be accustomed to because 50 plus years, but I digress. So we're all going to have to deal with that as a society now, because we're unaccustomed to interacting directly with each other and having that immediate consequence for saying something terrible, for having a shitty point of view, and being held accountable for those things. So that's one part of it, is that we're all gonna have to adjust to that. But one of the earlier things that you asked Larry about, how do we progress, how do we do better, is that we all, every single one of us, myself included, need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Point blank, period. It's gonna suck, right? It's gonna suck. There's gonna be things that you've held dear, notions, ideals, favorites that you're gonna read something about, you're gonna be, illuminated about, and realize, crap, this person sucks, or this point of view sucks, or this episode isn't about what I thought it was. And you're gonna have to come to terms with that, recognize why you reacted the way and how, and then move forward, because you're not going to be the same person for the rest of your life, whether you interact with people directly or through the internet. And if we stop requiring that of ourselves and each other, we're going to continue to run into this wall of, well, I said, and then he said, and then we said it. All of our thoughts matter, and we're not accustomed to dealing with that after a year of being locked away from everybody else and only interacting with each other through screens. That's the issue. We're only interacting with each other like this. When you're watching content to like, unwind or, whatever, is completely different than socializing with people in this way. And I think the bell curve comes in that we haven't quite figured out how to adjust as a species to interacting with people, with each other and ourselves in a completely different way. So the bots are trash, right? But the people are who we have to hold accountable for this. We have to take a step back, like you said, Larry, and be like, okay, well, is this person like just upset because they haven't gone outside in 8 months, or do they have a legitimate point? Am I reacting from a place of trauma? Do I need to take a step back and go outside, take a walk around the block? Do I need to drink some water? You know what I mean? All of those things are possible. And I think with this age of instant gratification and instant updates and everything, we are unaccustomed to taking that step back and recognizing it, and not to keep putting disco out there, but that whole show is about addressing change and how different people navigate that. And I feel like it covers a whole bunch of different perspectives and a lot of the intersections in between that we might not have seen, that enough people should be like, oh wow, this is not about me, but I totally have been there. I've had that reaction to something. I've watched somebody deal with something like that. People aren't So it's going to take a minute, right? We're all going to have these really uncomfortable conversations and get over our own BS when it's, called out.
And the bottom line to all this is whatever we're going through right now, especially as we have the younger generations coming in, 5 and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if we're all still around, we'll all be looking at all of this through slightly different lenses, and culture will be having us look at, reflect on all this in a slightly different way. It's lovely. It's fun. So much fun watching the DS9, not even haters, but the people who just blew it off or didn't get it. People that looked at DS9 through a first run lens, and Voyager and Enterprise, like we've been saying, coming in fresh with no baggage. But even the people that went to that and they go back for the first time in 20 or 30 years and they're like, oh my God, that's a thing, much less that's their own version, much less what we're looking at the original series thoroughly. I want to throw one more thing out because we're coming down on time.
Can I make a joke to Kennedy really quick?
Last words in, huh?
I want to make a joke to Kennedy really quick, is that you're talking about like feeling like like you don't know how to interact with people. When I interviewed David Ajala, like in my car office, like I didn't want to get off the phone with him because I was like forgot that we weren't really friends. Like I was just interviewing him, and I was like, because I've been watching Discovery during lockdown, and I was like interviewing David Ajala for an article I was writing, and I was like, he's like, all right, go man, and I was like, oh. Yeah. All right. Bye. Like totally unprofessional.
Me and David Ajala are besties. Okay. I just interviewed him recently for a con. He's the coolest person, but you're right. I was like, so tell me all about yourself. And he's like, I was like, go. Like,
but if it had been like a year ago, I don't think I would have done that. To your point, right. I think I would have been a little bit cooler about it. And I was like, I'm a good journalist. What happened?
Tell me about your guest spot on Death in Paradise, because that's what I knew him from first. Here's the thing I want to throw that's funny. We have been aware so long about the reaction that Discovery had, for lack of a better word, among the old white guys. I mean, the older generation reacting to all the things thrown at them to Discovery. Part of it was content, part of it was presentation, part of it was conceptual. And, it dawned on me how when people say canon, sometimes they mean conceptual canon. They don't mean visual canon. And, it's everything is good for everything. What's amazing to me is the last year or so, I've been aware of even sincere younger fans, the topic bubbling up. We've talked about this, John, about younger people sincerely wanting to watch the original series and how aspects of it seem problematic in some of the social lenses we now look through, but how the heart of the original series is still there. But the kids that I'll say kids, who they just talk about the 60s acting, the 60s pace, the 60s stylistic, choices. And I don't want to be the old man screaming on the yard, but I want to say, have you seen what else was on TV at the time? And I also want to say, have you never watched Casablanca? Have you never watched The Wizard of Oz?
No, they haven't. They haven't. Yeah. They haven't. They don't know that Chili Peppers redid a Stevie Wonder song, Larry. You're giving these Zoomers a little too much credit. They don't know because they don't have to.
I actually know these things. Yay.
Yeah,
see, you are the ambassador.
Yeah. Well, see, Allie, you're what, and I say this because people told me this, you're like what I would say was an old soul, like people who seem to be timeless no matter how, and people who are 80 and they're still out there doing whatever they're doing. I mean, it's like where age makes no difference. They just have that awareness. It's a bit like what John and Ryan have said. The great democratization of social media means everybody has an equal, everybody's, if you want to use it that way, everybody's, mouthpiece is equal. I remember thinking, gosh, I'm sorry, you were able to buy an iPad and you're a journalist? I'm sorry, I went to school for this. I went through training. People go through training to do, radio and TV, and now everybody and their dog is, which is great in some ways. We have citizen journalism, citizen blogging and all that. But then at the same time, I don't, does that seems to me a trend, but you don't want to walk up to some kid and say, come back in 10 years. I mean, I do, I kind of nicely kind of say, maybe you should take a look at that in another 5 or 10 years.
I think that's something that, I think it was Kennedy, you said something about reboot fatigue earlier. Something that I think that I wanted to say, just like that I think it makes Star Trek uniquely different with all of this, is that it's not like Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or Wonder Woman, because the characters are often different. I have a joke that somewhere in the book that I'm working on, that like imagining what Deep Space Nine is relative to another franchise is like impossible. Like imagine a Scooby-Doo spinoff that takes place in another city that does not have any of the same characters, no talking dog, and one appearance of the Mystery Machine, but it is still a Scooby-Doo show.
It's
That's what
Scrappy-Doo.
Right, but no Scrappy-Doo. It's new characters. Scrappy-Doo only appears in the pilot with the Mystery Machine.
As a hand,
and
Those
that's
kids are gonna
it.
be mad. They're gonna be so
But
mad.
that's just one Star Trek spinoff, right? Like analogously. And I think that like that's why I keep saying that like I feel like Star Trek is like an art form rather than like a franchise, because like there's so many versions of it. And even with other parallel fandoms, Sherlock Holmes or whatever, you're talking about the same characters. And sure, Discovery brought back Spock, but like Pike and Number One were not characters. They were rough drafts of characters, right? And now they are characters.
This could be a whole different panel.
You know, but my point being though, I think that with the reason why Star Trek fandom is unique in some of this is that the change that happens is very radical. It's not like they just changed Batman's costume or he talks different. It's that they're like saying there's no Batman, but it's still the same thing. And I think that radical change is part of why the fandom arguments or whatever we're talking about feel so different and always have.
Can I pose a question really quick to, all of you? As a younger Star Trek fan, or I guess I wouldn't consider myself super young. There are many younger fans than me. I'm not calling out any older fans or anything.
No. I hope there are.
All Star Trek fans are Star Trek fans. And that's kind of where I'm going. So a really quick story is when I went to the Deep Space Nine documentary, I was all done up in my Deep Space Nine gear. And I walked out of the theater after it was done. And I had a fan approach me, an older fan, and insinuate that I couldn't be a Star Trek fan because I was too young. You can't appreciate it in the same way that I can appreciate it. And all that. And so I guess I'm just posing that to you. I know none of you hold that view, and that's
Did you say
ridiculous.
something to that person in the moment?
I talked about Deep Space Nine and how I loved it and the characters that I loved and the episodes that I loved, and he was like, "Well, you're just being a poser Star Trek fan."
No, that's
I'm
why you
sorry.
don't engage with underdeveloped civilizations. It's
I
rule
ended up
one
walking
of Prime
away.
Directive. You can't
I was just like,
engage.
it's not worth it. But my question to you guys is, do you think, obviously not yourselves included, but are there, I've seen them before, but have you interacted or experienced Star Trek fans that say if you are not part of the original generation, you cannot be a fan? I feel like sometimes there is that negative viewpoint from some people as to younger fans, rather than just accepting, hey, if you like the franchise in any way, you're a Star Trek fan. It goes back to the whole like ownership of like, why do I have to make someone else, why should I make someone else abide to my viewpoints? Why can't we just be okay that they like what they like and that's fine, rather than saying you must like what I like? It's like that outward projection of I need you to have the same opinions as me so we can be okay, rather than just being like, oh, different perspective, cool, now I'm more informed because of that.
Oh, look, I'm not stagnating. Okay.
Right. I have thoughts, but I want to hear from John first.
Yeah.
So the last time I looked up the price of admission for being a Star Trek fan, it actually said that you just need to say that you're a Star Trek fan, and then you're a Star Trek fan. That is actually the price of admission for it. And what really worries me, because Ali, you've hit on something that concerns me about Star Trek fandom specifically, but fandom in general. And it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about here today, which is that when we kick around words like canon, I get really worried because we're introducing this almost religious-like layer upon something that I don't want to burst anybody's bubble. It's all fictional. It's all made up. It's all just stories that we tell each other about humanity, what it is to be alive, and what our aspirations and values are. That's all it is. That's all it is. But somehow this has become incredibly tribal, and it has become a definition for identity. And that's what really concerns me, because at the end of the day, we're talking about stories that help us to express what our values are. And Star Trek does that in a multitude of ways, over 800 plus now hours of entertainment. I am certain that in the 1930s, there were the kids who were the Buck Rogers fans who beat up the kids who were the Flash Gordon fans because, you know, it wasn't the one true science fiction that they loved, right? But what they didn't have, what we do have now, is this sort of this built-in system for expressing these terrible ideas, which then I think, Ali, to your experience, then just sort of encourages somebody who maybe doesn't understand that this isn't the right way to interact with another human being. It gives them license, gives them the ability to come up to another person and say, I'm now going to test and gatekeep your fandom, you know, your version of your fandom. I'm going to tell you about the thing that you say that you love. It's awful. It's terrible. I try to think of there is no appropriate parallel, but I try to think of another equally ridiculous parallel. Like if I were to drive to every restaurant that I don't eat in, just to let them know that I will not be eating at that restaurant because I don't like the way they prepare one particular thing. Like, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's a massive waste of time. And all that is just simply grandstanding because you're so invested in this identity of yourself as a fan, then you have to take it out on somebody who frankly doesn't deserve that at all. I'm sorry that has happened to you. It's not, it shouldn't be any comfort, but I will say that the same exact thing has happened to me early on and even more recently than I'd like to say. There was an Onion headline years ago that I kept because I thought it was so perfect, and it was like, it wasn't even a full article. It was just the headline. And it was this, you know, snobby looking film expert. And the headline quote was just, "You mean you haven't seen every movie ever made?" Mm. And I feel like that, like my fandoms run in many different places. I love classic movies. I love Star Trek. I love Star Wars. I love James Bond. I love Indiana Jones. But you know what? I haven't seen A Man from U.N.C.L.E. Yeah, but I haven't seen everything ever made. And I kind of hope that I don't see everything ever made, because it means there's always something else out there for me to discover that's much more interesting than putting yourself up on a pedestal as being the the know-all be-all of fandom. It's not a contest, guys. It's not a contest at all. Again, you already passed the price of admission, Ali.
Right.
Well, that's the thing though too, is that they automatically assume, they're like, oh, you're 25. You didn't watch TOS. And I'm like,
Right.
yes, I did. Or, oh, you didn't watch Deep Space Nine. You haven't seen all the TOS movies. I'm like, I've seen everything. So why are you automatically assuming that I only watch Discovery?
Guys, I have to land the plane. This is so good. I hate to do this at a time when we're like at a peak here. But I just want to say that was a great wrap up, John, and brings me totally back to my original point. Yay, Star Trek. It feels like we're exactly reflecting the culture at large.
Yeah. And to end on that note, Larry, to your point, Ali, I think that what you're describing is a symptom of folks who weren't represented enough in some facet or another. A lot of marginalized people feel this way. A lot of nerds feel this way because we were so openly ostracized for liking a thing, whatever it is, that when instead of, as opposed to like sports people who like, oh, you like this team too? Cool, let's get it. Where it doesn't matter why you like the team, as long as you like the team, we're on the same team, is that they're not publicly ostracized for liking that sport or that team or that color or what that player, whatever. Whereas everyone else, ourselves included, have gotten shit for liking something that isn't quote unquote normal. So when people need to remember kind of what John was saying, it's not pie, right? Equal representation, equal access does not take away from anybody else. Like, you can like what you like for your reasons, and I can like what I like for my reasons. I've been interacting with a lot of younger Trek fans, and they're just like, I love it for all these reasons. And I'm like, I am so thrilled that you could be out and open and loving Trek and not get the shit kicked out of you. Like, this is so great.
And that is a cool thing, that we do live in a time, at least we've progressed, where Comic-Con culture, which began with Star Trek con culture and media cons, which started when the old lit snob fans at the World Cons gatekeeped on original Star Trek fans and said, well, that's fine to worship a show, but you really need to read all the classic authors. And they said, fine, we'll go off and do our own convention. Bang, we are where we have today. So that now we're at the point where you can have blue paint on your face And you can either be blue paint because you're a Boston or a New England Patriots fan, or you're an Andorian. Whatever it is, we've had an equality.
Booleans. Booleans don't get enough love.
They
love
really
Booleans.
don't.
Your balls, you can go there.
Sick reference.
Guys, I have to land this. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you again, everybody. We're going to put everybody's stuff in the blur in the graph where we're going to reach. So they're letting us do that. But real quick, run down the line. Give me one place where everybody can find you.
My name starts with A, but I'm primarily on Twitter at @trekkie.
Okay, Ryan.
You can find me at ryanbrittwriter.com.
Okay, John.
Just go to podcast.roddenberry.com. Subscribe to all of them. Get every last one of them.
Yes,
there you
please.
go.
And Kennedy.
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at @thatmikeychick. That's that MIKEYCHICK. Don't act up in my comments because I will drag you publicly and then block you afterwards.
Okay.
Bravo.
I've seen it.
So much. Thank you guys so much. I'll be seeing everybody around there too. Thank you for joining me, and thanks everybody for joining us live and later. Please leave comments. These things are up for a while now, and I will just end us all out and say thanks so much, and trek well, everybody. Are we going to do it? We'll do the thing.
We can all do that. There we
can
go.
all do the Vulcan
Yeah,
thing.
we can all do the thing. Both hands.
Let's fly.
Yeah.
Thanks.